Wayfinding in Final Fantasy VIII has been a recent topic of conversation on the channel, and one that seems to have evoked many memories and commentaries of player experiences with that game. And taking a step back, it is surprising on reflection how different Final Fantasy VIII was in how it arranged locations and instructions that did perhaps veer into frustrating design at a couple of instances, and dare I say perhaps bad design that at its most egregious was the task to find the elusive White SeeD Ship on the world map about midway through the story. Now, to preface this discussion, I've long been a fan and a defender of Final Fantasy VIII, but at the same time I do understand why many other players don't like the game as much, and for my part I do indeed share in the lingering trauma of the lost hours and days spent trying to find the White SeeD Ship. So what is the deal with the White SeeD Ship? What are the distinctive features of Final Fantasy VIII's design that make wayfinding and story progression a little bit different from its contemporaries, and how much weight do we put on this being bad game design over player attentiveness? Jumping right in and looking at the composition of Final Fantasy VIII's world, from the very outset of the game it advocates a certain non-linear design wherein we start off in the centre of Balamb Island, outside Balamb Garden. We have Balamb Town to the west of us, and we have the Fire Cavern off in the opposite direction. Now, looking to other Final Fantasy games, they employ what I would call the illusion of scope and the illusion of freedom, while in fact they are providing a pretty linear sort of progression. So for example, exiting Midgar onto the world map in Final Fantasy VII, it feels like this immense freedom and liberation for the player after spending so long stuck in this city for the first act of the game. But actually what we have on that first trip into the overworld is the chronological steps of the Village of Calm, Chocobo Farm, and the Mithril Mines, which is pretty much in the order that we need to visit them and the way that the story progresses. Likewise, in Final Fantasy IX, we exit the Evil Forest into the overworld for the first time, the Mist Continent, where we can visit a locked gate location that doesn't really take us anywhere, it's just somewhere that we can buy items. Or alternatively, we can head in the right direction. We can go to the Ice Cave, which is the next chronological location for story progression. So in both these cases, we are intuitively funneled, and really the purpose of the overworld at this stage of the game is to grind through random encounters if we choose to, level up our characters and stuff like that. So Final Fantasy VIII, by comparison, looking to the overworld design, we have Balamb Island as this entry point, and it tries to offset the non-linear design by being a small self-contained island with only 3 locations in it. But then looking more broadly to later in the game, we have instances where we must traverse the world to, for example, find the missile base or find Galbadia Garden, and most heinously the White SeeD Ship, pretty much on our own across a massive swath of overworld and continent. So in these instances, it's the non-linear arrangement of the world that becomes a little bit more trickier for some players to navigate, and particularly the White SeeD Ship scenario, where we have access to Garden as transport now. We can pretty much scour the entire world looking for it if we choose to, and there's nothing to limit us or funnel us intuitively towards our goal, geographically speaking. Looking to similar stages of comparable games, so Final Fantasy VII for example, we have a pretty intuitive route from, say, Junon to Costa del Sol, to Corel, to Gold Saucer, Gongaga, Cosmo Canyon, and so on. We have available transport, which is limited in where it can go, so the buggy for example, and we have the topography and the geography of the world, which again limits us and guides us where we need to go. So we can quite intuitively kind of funnel towards our goal. And while it's not perfect as a game, with Final Fantasy VII becoming a bit confusing for me personally when it came to getting to Rocket Town, there was no clear direction there, the Temple of the Ancients, and indeed after leaving the Temple of the Ancients getting to the City of the Ancients, because somehow Aerith travelled across the entire world in 20 minutes. So there was a lack of clarity in certain points of Final Fantasy VII for sure. It wasn't perfect, but on the whole, it was a very concisely and intuitively designed world map and progression through that world map, I think, through the geography, through the limitations of of various transport at various points in the game. The next point regarding Final Fantasy VIII's wayfinding and progression, which is particularly heinous, I think, when it comes to finding the White SeeD Ship, is its reliance on not just dialogue instruction, but discreetly placed event triggers too, by which I mean you can't do the next thing, like find the White SeeD Ship, until a certain scenario or dialogue has taken place to trigger it. So there's a couple of instances of this in the game which confused me on my earliest playthroughs, which aren't simply confined to overworld events either. So for example, in both the Missile Base and the Galbadian occupation of Balam Town scenarios, you progress through these situations with sequential dialogues with NPCs. So for example, in Balam, you're trying to find the captain, which is Ragin, who's hidden away in the train station, and there's a couple of sequential events, dialogues you need to do to trigger this, to discover him, which involves talking to Ma Dinched about the smelly fish that's being cooked, getting a dog to pick up the scent to go and find him, and so on. And it's a bit of a puzzle to get those events to sort of take place, because you need to go to the harbour, you need to go back into town, so on and so forth. And it's something that I did get stuck on in my early playthroughs, admittedly with the caveat that I was 10 years old at the time. But coming onto the White SeeD Ship, and actually the events that lead into it, this is a particularly frustrating example of event triggers clashing with exposition and instruction. So first off, for context, we have the Battle of the Gardens, we have a boss fight with Adia, where the sorceress powers get transferred to Renoa, she goes into a coma, and we wake up in Squall's dorm room, in actually one of the many things I love about Final Fantasy VIII, which is these recurring moments of reprieve and reflection that Squall has following a dramatic event. So I really like those moments in FF8. But from here, we are pretty much left to our own devices, and we only have vague NPC incidental dialogues to prompt us on our next step, which is to go to the orphanage and visit Adia. Upon visiting Adia, we get the exposition dump where she talks about Artemisia, all of this stuff. She mentions the White SeeD Ship and Alone, and then Squall follows up on this in Garden by making an announcement saying, okay, Adia's no longer a bad guy, and we need to find the White SeeD Ship. So at this point, the player may be forgiven for thinking, this is what we need to do next, we need to go and find the White SeeD Ship. But actually, the real trigger to make the White SeeD Ship appear is visiting Renoa in the infirmary and prompting the next Laguna dream. So we have literally no indication that we need to go and do this and visit Renoa, aside from a bit of optional dialogue from Quistis saying, Renoa's in the infirmary, I might go and see her later, which isn't even really an instruction, it's just a non-committal dialogue bark from an NPC. And this can really catch people out, I think. Even having played Final Fantasy VIII many times, as I have, I got to this part of the quest a couple of years ago on my first playthrough in ages, and I immediately thought to go to find the White SeeD Ship. I thought I knew where it was. I couldn't find it. I cross-referenced it with online guides, maps, YouTube videos, and I was like, it's definitely not there. And I was completely thrown because I forgot the small trigger of this event, this questline, was to visit Renoa first. So, as much as I love Final Fantasy VIII, I think that was a really janky segue, on top of the vague hints at where the SeeD Ship is in the first place, which I would really struggle to do without any sort of strategy guide. And this brings me on to the final point about games of this particular period that a recent comment reminded me of, which is strategy guides. Now, it's interesting because I've had some comments in the past suggesting that games today are built with things like live streaming and influencers in mind, trophy reward mechanisms and things like that. Very much a contemporary thing. However, in the past, there was very much a different agenda, one of which was perhaps the ability to cross-sell or upsell with other merchandise, and specifically strategy guides, which were becoming increasingly popular through the 1990s. And some have argued that Final Fantasy VIII's breadth and puzzling design was maybe consciously designed that way to help cross-sell with the official walkthrough. And that's not beyond the realms of possibility, and it is perhaps no accident that Final Fantasy VIII was the first strategy guide that I ended up getting. I remember seeing it prominently displayed in stores as a kid, and I think it was also it was the first Final Fantasy strategy guide produced by the UK publishing house Piggyback, and they were formed in 1999. Their first guides were Metal Gear Solid and Silent Hill, and then their third official strategy guide was Final Fantasy VIII, and they subsequently did all of the Final Fantasy games up until 15. And this is interesting to consider because this publishing house was the first sort of major UK EU distribution house that Final Fantasy got for its strategy guides. Before that we had Final Fantasy VII, and I think the only official strategy guide for that was Brady Games, which was an American publisher. So perhaps Square saw the opportunities for broader cross-selling opportunities, wider distribution and publication of walkthroughs at this time. But I suppose the question is did that actually influence the way the game was designed and the puzzles, the side quests and the secrets and so on that were added to Final Fantasy VIII? I'm not sure. It's possible, because things like the Obel Lake minigame side quest or the alien encounters with Poo Poo, for example, that stuff would be borderline impossible to find, let alone complete, without the aid of an external walkthrough. So, interesting question there, and whether these external factors influence design is a real possibility. So, in all, as a follow-up episode to considerations of Final Fantasy VIII's overworld design, the wayfinding, the use of vague instructions and directions from NPCs, such as head south to the southern tip of Centra Island, to find the orphanage, for example, rather than this geographical or chronological funneling into different locations or quests, as other comparable games did, like Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy IX. It is an interesting point to raise, and has been raised in response to an earlier episode I did. I think the fact that we obtain a very broad means of transport in Balam Garden early on, where we can pretty much cover the entire world, and finally the somewhat ambiguous event triggers at certain points of Final Fantasy VIII, making the next part of the quest hard to decipher or find. I do concede this all kind of added perhaps to the weird wayfinding and difficulty at certain junctures of Final Fantasy VIII, to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the player. As I say, I got stuck at a couple of points in the game on early playthroughs that perhaps others didn't, such as the Balam Town occupation scenario, whereas there are other places where players got stuck that I didn't find much difficulty with. So again, dependent on the player there as well. And I suppose, finally, considering whether or not this actually diminished the overall game experience and appreciation of Final Fantasy VIII long term is a different question and a different matter. I think the fact that so many of us are still discussing the shared trauma of the SeeD Ship 25 years later is in its own way endearing to the game, looked at a certain way. And again, I've long been a huge fan of the title, so while I acknowledge the frustrations that many, including myself, had at certain points of the game, I think you can view it as a negative or a novelty of Final Fantasy VIII. I really liked the player agency, or actually the onus being placed on the player to sort of muddle through on their own and uncover this adventure on their own terms. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon. Alternatively, if you feel like donating me a coffee, you can do so. The links are available below.